All right, we're back for more political transformations, learning about the empires and their encounters from 1450 to 1750. And our focus for Section 2 is a comparison of those colonial societies that were established by Europeans in the Americas. And this is a great section because not only do we get to compare those societies in the Americas, we really get to look at the colonies that were established and based off of the sugar trade and the importance of the sugar trade. So, Europeans didn't just conquer and govern those established colonies. They created wholly new societies, and they were all shaped by mercantilism. And this is a very important economic theory. It's the theory that governments should encourage exports from their colonies and accumulate that wealth or bullion to serve their countries. And the colonies should provide the closed markets for the mother country's manufactured goods. So what happens is the mother country takes all of the raw materials from the colonies back to the mother country, produces manufactured goods, and then sells them back to the colonies in closed markets. And those colonies are only allowed to purchase those manufactured goods from the mother country. So it's a very exploitative system. But mercantilism was a big part of the rivalry that we talked about in Section 1, and it's a very important economic system that's really a defining factor during this 1450 to 1750 time period. But the colonies differed widely amongst each other. And this really depended on the native cultures that were already in existence and the sorts of economies that were already established. And women experienced colonial intrusion in quite distinct ways. The elite women often married to Spanish conquerors as a way of really cementing their relationships. And many women experienced sexual violence and abuse. A lot of and it wasn't just the native women, but the European migrants as well. So let's talk about in the land of the Aztecs and the Incas. Okay, so the Spanish conquest of the Aztec and the Inca empires was early 16th century, right? Early 1500s. And this was the most wealthy, urbanized, and populous regions of the entire Western Hemisphere. And within just a century, the Spaniards established major cities, universities, and created a religious and bureaucratic infrastructure that their entire society was based on. And this was an economic basis of their colonial society: commercial agriculture and mining. The mining of gold and silver was vital to colonial Spain. And we'll get more into the silver trade, especially that in Bolivia, and how the silver trade completely transformed the world market, along with the sugar trade. Now, let's talk about the rise of a distinctive social order in colonial Spain. And it was really replicated on some of the Spanish class hierarchy that existed back in Spain. In theory, it was thought to accommodate everyone: the natives, the Africans, even the racially mixed people. The Spaniards were at the top, and they essentially and eventually increasingly wanted large measure of self-government from the Spanish crown, which of course led to a lot of independent countries in South America. However, let's get back on track. The emergence of the mestizo or mixed race population, the gross abuse and exploitation of the natives, and how much more racially, believe it or not, despite the abuse and exploitation, it was more racially fluid than what developed in North America. And the systems in colonial Spain were the encomienda system, the repartimiento system, and the hacienda system. And this was a series of Spanish colonial legal systems for controlling the land and the labor. In the encomienda system, the Spanish settlers were given control over a community and allowed to extract wealth and labor as they saw fit. And of course, that came with blatant abuses. And so the second system was under more direct government supervision, but it was still abusive. And in the last system, the hacienda system, the Spaniards built large estates and they paid peons. Yes, that's a word all of you, I'm sure, have heard before. But they paid peons, of course, very small and low wages, to work for them. And so those were the three legal systems for how they controlled the land and the labor: encomienda, repartimiento, and hacienda. Now, in the Creoles and the Peninsulares, those were the ones that were at the top of society. And that's the purity of blood. The pure-blooded Spanish were very concerned about their undiluted blood, and they also saw distinctions among themselves. So those born in the colonies, or Creoles, were inferior to those that were from or born in the on the Iberian Peninsula, Peninsulares. Yet both were superior to the mixed race, indigenous, and Africans. And the Spanish men jealously guarded their women from the mixed race, indigenous, and African men who might dilute the community's blood and tarnish their honor. Below that were the mestizos. And these mixed race individuals were divided into numerous groups, castas, or castes. Remember, that's a Portuguese word for purity of blood. And this was based on their percentage of Spanish, native, and African blood. And as there were very few Spanish women, a lot of those Spanish men took mestiza wives, indicating an obvious gender double standard. And then the natives, the indigenous population, not only suffered from the Great Dying that we talked about in Section 1, but also from the exploitative colonial regime that was established. Many surviving native women sought refuge in mixed or Spanish marriages just to protect their children from many of the colonial abuses. Okay, let's talk about the colonies of sugar. I can't even begin to explain how fascinating the sugar trade is. Lowland Brazil and the Caribbean developed very different societies from those other than those in the South America, and definitely different from those in North America. The regions had not really been home to these great civilizations like the Aztec and the Inca, and so they didn't have great mineral wealth until the 1690s, which is nearly 200 years later. But sugar was in high demand in Europe. And so these colonies produced almost solely for export. The Portuguese developed Brazil's monopoly, basically 1570 to 1670. After learning about sugar from the Arabs in the Mediterranean, the Portuguese pioneered sugar production in Brazil and enjoyed basically a century-long monopoly until the British, Dutch, and French got involved in the Caribbean. And the labor-intensive and international mass market basically came about because of sugar. Sugar production and refining was extremely labor-intensive, required a type of organization similar to the industrial factories that hadn't even been created yet. And the labor demands could not be met by the local population, especially after the Great Dying of the native populations. So slaves were then imported from Africa. And the commodity was consumed by a mass market overseas, making the plantation complex an important development in world history. And so sugar basically transformed Brazil and then, of course, later the Caribbean. The production, like I said, was labor-intensive. It worked best on a large scale in order to really be productive. And it's basically the first modern global industry. It's always produced with the massive use of slaves. And that was because, like I mentioned, the natives of the area that were almost totally wiped out or fled. And it's documented that the planters that turned to African slaves basically took about 80% of all of the Africans enslaved in the Americas, ended up in Brazil and the Caribbean. So if you think there were a lot that were transported and enslaved in North America, that all of those, that was only about 20% that were enslaved in the Americas. 80% of them were either in Brazil or the Caribbean, and it was specifically for those sugar plantations because they're so labor intensive and the demand was incredible. So 80% of Africans taken to the New World went to those sugar plantations. These colonies maintained large populations that were born in Africa. Then, of course, recently enslaved, in contrast to North America, where most of the slaves were born in the New World. Brazil had a large population of mixed-race individuals with African lineages, and those are known as mulattoes. Rather than the clear racial divisions of North America, right, white, red, black, Brazil had numerous categories of mixed races with differing levels of social status. Very complex social system. And Brazil and the Caribbean society, like I said, most of it was of African descent. And there were these large mixed race populations that provided much of the urban skilled workforce and the supervisors that were needed for the sugar industry. And so thus this plantation complex based on African slavery is what spread to the southern parts of North America. European women came earlier, and the result was less racial mixing, less tolerance toward the mixed blood. And that's the distinct racial divisions that developed in the southern parts of North America, albeit slavery was actually less harsh. And it really sharply defined the racial system that evolved in North America. Okay, so I put together a couple of documents. This is not information that you need to write down, but I really want you guys to look over this, read over this, so you get a clear perspective on how important the sugar trade was. So we have the climate that's showing, of course, averages for Jamaica and Barbados, 2 islands in the Caribbean. Their latitude is on the 18 degrees north and 13 degrees north. That lies within the latitude range needed for sugar production. The temperature range, 68 to 86 and 72 to 86, falls right in the middle, needed for sugar production. The soil type is spot on. It's clay, silt, right from flooding waters, and sand mix. And the rainfall, 77 inches, more in the north and less in the south, and then 60 inches a year, but with considerable variety. That's less than, for example, the average that's needed. However, a lot of the rain in both of these islands comes at the right time of the year. So it doesn't necessarily have to be spread equally throughout the entire year. It just comes at the right time when it's the sugar needs it. Okay, this next document is from Benjamin Moseley, Doctor, MD. Written in 1800, a treatise on sugar with miscellaneous medical observations. And I think this statement is amazing. It really essentially sums it up. The increased consumption of sugar and increasing demand for it exceed all comparison with any other article used as an auxiliary in food, for such is the influence of sugar that once touching the nerves of taste, no person was ever known to have the power of relinquishing the desire for it. So he's basically saying that the desire and the demand for sugar is so high that once you taste it, you'll never be able to get rid of that desire for it. Some people don't consume it, and that's a very strong willpower, but that doesn't necessarily mean they don't desire it. And this is a picture right here on the left that shows a hogshead of sugar. That's a large barrel. It weighs about 700 to 1,200 pounds full of sugar. That is 700 to 1,200 pounds of sugar. And in the 1760s, the typical West Indian trade ship carried about 65 of these things as part of its cargo. Historians aren't sure why it's called a hogshead. However, it is. And they'd carry about 65 of these things. And this image, I think, really does you justice on how much of a demand sugar was when it made it back to Europe. I mean, people are literally swimming in this hogshead of sugar and climbing in the barrel. And, I mean, it's in the street, and here they go. Look, it's fallen out here. People are picking it up. This kid's probably got his head next to a hole, right, where the sugar's coming out. They absolutely loved it. And this list here on the right, I thought it was important to give you an idea of a sugar plantation of about 500 acres of land. What's required to operate a sugar plantation? A dwelling house, 2 windmills, a boiling house, a distilling house, a curing house large enough to contain at least 2,500 pots, a stable to hold about 30 horses with the loft over it for dry grain, a rum house, a house for servants, a sick house, that would be like an infirmary, a proper room to confine disorderly Negroes, a storehouse for salt provisions, a smith shop, a cooper shop, a trash house, and a store for English goods. It requires 300 slaves, 150 head of cattle, 25 horses, and about 50 head of sheep. The average cost of an adult male slave in the West Indies in the early 1700s is about 25 pounds. And uncleared land in Jamaica in 1755 sold for well less than £1 an acre. And a head of cattle in Jamaica was valued at about 15 pounds. So that tells you how valuable slaves were to the sugar production. They were worth more than cattle and the land itself. And at 14 pence per day, a day laborer in England in the early 1700s earned about 18 pounds per year. So they couldn't even cover in a year how much it costs for an adult male slave. But all of that is required for a sugar plantation of 500 acres to operate and function at a profit. So we're talking labor and capital intensive. And this next document, I think this next document's awesome. Because a lot of people don't, you just sit there and look at what's needed, how important sugar became, the demand for it, the desire for it. But Sidney Mintz wrote in Sweetness and Power, the Place of Sugar in Modern Industry, in 1985, really puts whole nother spin on this perspective. Sugar as sweetener came to the fore in connection with 3 other exotic imports: tea, coffee, and chocolate. Now, let's pause right there. I don't know if any of you have ever had tea, coffee, or chocolate without sugar, but most people don't like it. How popular is sweet tea as opposed to regular tea? Yeah, there are people out there that drink regular tea, and I guarantee it's because they don't want to consume the sugar because of what it does to their body, not because they don't want it. But I'm willing to bet they favor, by taste, sweet tea. Some people drink their coffee black, not many, after all the mochas and frappes and cappuccinos and lattes and I don't know, whatever. I don't drink coffee, so whatever else there is, I don't know. But most people put sugar in their coffee. And even if they don't put sugar in their coffee, they put a dairy product in their coffee. And by definition, dairy is a natural sweetener. So even if they don't put sugar in there, when they put that milk or cream or creamer or whatever they're putting in their coffee, they're still sweetening it. And of course, chocolate. I'm not a big fan of plain chocolate or cocoa, and I don't really even like dark chocolate because it has less sugar in it. But it's actually, chocolate without sugar is pretty nasty. But one of which tea became and has since remained the most important non-alcoholic beverage in the United Kingdom. Guys, they still sit down and have their afternoon tea with their sugar. And all are tropical products. All were new to England in the 3rd quarter of the 17th century. All contain stimulants and can be properly classified as drugs, together with tobacco and rum, though clearly different both in effects and addictiveness. All began as competitors for British preference, so that the preference of each probably affected to some extent the fate of the others. So what they're saying is that not only is sugar interconnected with tea, and sugar connected with coffee, and sugar connected with chocolate, but tea, coffee, and chocolate are all connected to each other because of sugar. And I mean, look at tea. That is still like the national non-alcoholic beverage of the British, and that's because of sugar. And I've got this image here. So what are the people doing in this painting? This is a great, colorful visual that shows, the work being performed here. This is an image of African slaves working on a sugar plantation on the British-ruled Caribbean island of Antigua. The slaves are lined up along the length of the field and are breaking and tilling the ground for planting with those long hand hoes, right? You can see them right here, the garden hose. And in the center of the picture, 3 slaves seem to be marking the field with intervals, with sticks, probably for where they the sugar needs to be planted, the sugar cane. And let's talk about these 3 small figures to the left in this scene. The tallest of the 3 looks like an older woman. The other 2 might be children, maybe too young for field work, but of course there's still other duties and tasks that they have to perform. Let's talk about the standing male figure in the right front of the image. Who is this guy? Well, he looks like an overseer, and given his skin color, probably also a slave. But he is directing, it looks like he's directing one of the slaves, and he's carrying a whip in his left hand, which is the tool in which he would have exercised force and power over the other slaves in the plantation system. So why do you think they would use another slave as the overseer for them? And it doesn't really have anything to do with they didn't want to do it themselves. But think about how demoralizing it is for this man and for the slaves to have one of your own, the one that's whipping you, the one that's beating you, and he's also a slave. How demoralizing is that? This guy's the one, right, performing the beatings and, making everyone hate him as opposed to the master. So there's a whole psychological warfare here going on between the slaves and the masters without the slaves even realizing it. As they wanted, it's easy to hate your master that's, of his different skin color and different continent, if he's the one that's doing all the beating. But if it's one of your own, God, can you imagine what that does to a people psychologically? Woo. Okay, the settler colonies in North America. A different sort of colonial society emerged in the British colonies of New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. The British kind of got into the game late, so they got the unpromising lands. They got the leftovers. And, sometimes the leftovers don't have everything in them. They're cold, and it's not all there, right? Sometimes leftovers are good, but most of the time not, especially in this case when you're talking about land. And but a British society was also changing more rapidly than Catholic Spain. And many British colonists were trying to escape the elements of European society. So their society was transitioning, and it was changing. And so they were escaping European society, and they're coming to the New World. And it's changing faster than what was changing in Catholic Spain. Spain and Portugal were wealthier, and they seized more colonies first, right? The British were left with the leftovers of the Americas, and that New England seemed underproductive and lacked wealthy mines, because the focus here, that was sugar and tobacco and silver, right? that's where the focus was. So, New England, New York, and Pennsylvania don't look like they have a lot of wealthy mines or can produce sugar because obviously the climate's the wrong climate. But, the British side was changing at the time. There were intense disputes between kings and nobles, civil war in England, and a rising merchant class. And the Catholic-Protestant conflicts encouraged large numbers of dissenting religious groups to leave for the freedom of the colonies. And there was basically like a class equality, but with gender inequality. In the New England colonies, they established family-run small farms, unlike the hereditary land estates of Old England or those large haciendas and plantations in colonial Spain. And while the intense social stratification of Europe was not imported to New England, that conservative Protestant community, or communities that developed here, were extremely patriarchal and definitely restricted women's rights. So there might have been class equality, but there was definitely gender inequality. And the British settlers were more numerous by 1750. They outnumbered the Spanish in the New World 5-1. Remember that map you saw and how much larger Spanish territory was compared to the British? However, the British outnumbered the Spaniards 5-1 by 1750, by the end of this era. So that's how many British settlers were leaving England and going elsewhere. By 1776, notice the year there, about 90% of the population in North America was European. 90%. The natives were killed off by disease or military policies. And the small-scale farming that existed in specifically in New England and New York and Pennsylvania really didn't need slaves. They weren't these large plantations of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. We're talking small-scale farming. But the pure settler societies also came with, little racial mixing. These were colonies of settlement with few surviving indigenous peoples and few African slaves. British women came in large numbers. Unlike the Spanish women, the white population was self-replicating, and there was little mixing of the races. And that's the sharp racial distinction that I mentioned earlier. In Protestantism and weak royal control were also a big part of the English migrants. Unlike the Catholic colonies to the south, the Protestants had much less interest in converting the native people. They didn't proselytize like the Catholics did. They weren't out to convert them from one religion to another. They did encourage literacy amongst the white population. And also, in contrast to the Spanish colonies, there was no strong royal bureaucracy. There was a big, strong government hand in colonial Spain throughout this time period. And there was a royal bureaucracy. Not even a royal bureaucracy. The colonies in North America, there was a bureaucratic system kind of in place, but because everything was so different, there wasn't a real strong royal bureaucracy. And rather, there were trading companies and wealthy sponsors and self-governing communities. And that's what developed in North America. So it gradually became dominant, even more developed than South America because of that. And that's it.